Okay. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I know it's a busy time of year, and I appreciate all of you for taking time out of your week to be able to join us tonight. My name is Kate Rosa. I am a senior climate resilience project manager with the City of Boston Office of Climate Resilience. And before we get started, I just want to see if there are any elected officials in tonight's audience or office representatives. If you can just use the reaction button just to give us a little wave, or if you are an elected official and you'd like to speak, if you'd like to say a few words before we begin, I welcome you to come off mute now if you'd like. Okay. Someone might join us later, so we'll leave room for that. Before we begin our presentation, I also just wanted to ask, do we have any press officials in the room? Again, if you can just use your reaction button to give a little wave. We've already gone through that we will be recording this, but just give us a little wave if you are a member of the press in the room tonight. Wonderful. So we do have some folks in the room tonight. Thank you, Delaney. All right. So I will go ahead and get started. I want to first welcome our first speaker, the director of the Office of Climate Resilience, Chris Osgood, to kind of walk us through some of the goals for tonight and a little bit of background on the project. Thanks, Chris.
Kate, thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership of this project. As Kate said, I have the great pleasure of leading the City of Boston's Office of Climate Resilience, and on behalf of Mayor Michelle Wu and on behalf of our Chief Climate Officer, Brian Sweat, I want to thank you not only for being here tonight, but for all of the work that all of you have been putting in to address the climate risks in front of us and to enhance the city that we love. The focus of tonight's effort is really to talk about some of the long-term projects the city is exploring in collaboration with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to protect people and to protect communities for the balance of this century. And the foundation for this work is work that many of you are very, very familiar with and have played a role in shaping, and that's Climate Ready Boston. That data-informed, community-driven plan is the foundation to the city's work on extreme heat, on stormwater flooding, on coastal flooding. And with respect to coastal flooding, there are three strategies that the city is advancing at the same time, but focused on different time horizons. And you will hear about all three of those strategies tonight, although the focus will be the third one. That first strategy is really work that we're doing as a city, led by our Office of Emergency Management, to make sure that we are prepared and supported during any extreme weather event that may occur in the very near term. The second strategy of work that we're focused on is a set of projects really focused on the nearer term flood paths. In East Boston, that's places like Border Street, Bennington Street, Lewis Street, Carlton Wharf, places that many of you know, and projects that many of you are participating in. And Kate will talk a little bit about some of those, the work that we're doing as a city to address flood risks in those areas. But the balance of this meeting is really about our collaboration with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and you'll hear from Jeff Herzog, who's the project manager for the U.S. Army Corps, talk a little bit about that work. And we are very excited to partner with the U.S. Army Corps. They bring a tremendous amount of experience and expertise and capacity to address coastal flood risk here in our city and elsewhere. And we want to make sure that our community is engaged in that process and informing the designs that come out of it. Over the last 3 years, the Corps has largely focused on the risk if we do not act in the long term. The next 3 years are really about shaping what sort of long-term interventions would work best for our neighborhoods to protect all of you. And tonight is about sort of the first step of that. It's about talking through that process, what's going to happen over the course of the next 3 years in terms of refining ideas and designs, and then talking a little bit about the locations or the alignments that the Army Corps is looking at to pursue flood risk reducing projects in East Boston. This is part of a comprehensive citywide plan, and there will be more opportunities both for East Boston and citywide over the course of this year and really over the next 3 years. In the next 3 years, we will get to a milestone of submitting a plan to Congress. That submission of the plan to Congress then unlocks the opportunity for federal financial participation and further collaboration with the Army Corps to refine those designs and eventually to construct those projects. So there'll be a lot of opportunity for further engagement after tonight, but it's fantastic to have you here at this point as we really want to make sure that everybody is engaged both in the process and giving feedback on the alignments. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kate, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Chris. So just to kind of recap what we hope to achieve today, we're going to walk through those three different time scenarios that Chris just mentioned, what we're doing for today's storms, what we're doing for the next decade, and then talk more about our Army Corps partnership and beyond. And when time allows, we're going to have opportunities for asking questions, as well as giving you next steps on how you can follow up, provide us with feedback, and also contact us for more information. So just to kind of set the stage and give a little bit of background, we, the City of Boston, have been working to understand how climate change is going to impact us here locally since 2016, when our first Climate Ready Boston report was released, which gave us the localized special data that helped us to understand how Boston specifically was going to be impacted by extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation, more frequent and more intense rain events, sea level rise, and what the impact of future coastal storms would be too. All of these impacts mean we might have more frequent and more intense effects like heat waves and droughts, stormwater flooding, and flooding from coastal storm events. So life in the extremes. In 2017, we really focused on putting together our vision for the resilient Boston Harbor and looking at what the opportunity would be for us to plan the next 100 years of our 47-mile coastline so that we can better prepare for these sea level rise changes, for more frequent and intense flooding events, and also understanding how being able to work in the waterfront is a once in a lifetime opportunity for being able to expand, improve our existing park system and public access, like our harbor walk, as well as being able to create an environmentally equitable and just um, reintroduction of our coastal city. So really thinking about this as our our vision for what Boston Harbor's future and our City of Boston waterfront can look like. We then looked at the community level plans starting in 2017 and working through 2022, and really started to look at for each neighborhood what the impacts would be and looked at a first look of what some conceptual plans could be in each neighborhood. So the map on the left, as a reminder, is showing a little more information around where we would expect to see flooding and what was predicted under our Climate Ready Boston original model, and also understanding that so many of the areas that are going to experience more frequent and more severe flooding are the areas of our city that have been filled in over time. So these may not have been original land areas for the city of Boston, but ones that we as humans have impacted over time. And so before we get into our Army Corps work and giving you the details on what these plans will include, I like to set the stage. I put on my engineering hat, and I want to also help you to understand that sometimes it can feel like we are moving in circles. But as we add new information and make changes based on that information, we're actually sharing with you each step of the process, similar to a spiral staircase. So, what we started out in 2016 and 2017 is setting a vision and working through our conceptual plans between 2017 and 2022. We really are moving up levels, we're moving up floors with the eventual goal of getting to construction, operation, and maintenance of the things that we want to build, the places that we want to create these coastal protections. So stay with us here. I promise we're not just going in circles, we're also going up. It's a spiral staircase. But that being said, we don't need to wait for the future to see what the climate change storm impacts and flooding impacts can be. All we have to do is look around and look at our very recent past, our coastal flooding storms in 2018, 2022, every new king tide. We're entering into our king tide season. So even things like our intermittent flooding with a seasonally high tide. These photos are showing some of those extremes that we are witnessing in real time. So we understand that this isn't something that is happening far into the future. In fact, it's already happening, and that's why we are taking action now. So to kind of help us set the stage before we look ahead at beyond 2030 timelines. I have the opportunity to be able to introduce to you our Office of Emergency Management representative, Kyron Owens, who's here with us tonight, to kind of talk to you all a little bit more about what we're doing today for today's storms and how we're working with the City Office of Emergency Management to help strengthen our response and preparedness to local flooding. So, Kyron, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Office of Emergency Management. Once again, my name is Kyron Owens. I serve as the Communications Director um, at OEM, and so today I have the pleasure of letting you know how we, prepare for today's storms and what that process looks like. For those who don't know, the mission of the Office of Emergency Management is to enhance the city's capacity to protect against, prevent, prepare for, respond to, recover from, mitigate any emergencies that could impact the city, regardless of scope or scale. And so, what you see on the slide before you is how we go about that, right? It doesn't just start on the day of, but it starts months in advance with doing public education about the different hazards that can impact the city. We will often partner with the Office of Climate Resilience to do presentations in the neighborhood. Most recently, I know we did one in East Boston earlier in the year, and it went really well because it really is a good merge of how do you prepare, but also what is the city doing, which you'll learn more about later on with some of the other presenters, but to really give you that holistic picture. We also will look at our operational planning. So we house all of the emergency plans on behalf of the city. We do an annual review or maintenance of them. And so oftentimes we're working with various departments across the city to make sure that they understand their roles. And, if there's any vulnerabilities that we're able to address them and kind of think collaboratively about how we turn that into a strength. So let's say there is a storm coming days before, hours before. We're constantly monitoring the forecast and the different projections. We often like to make a declaration in advance of any impact of a hazard. So we typically do that, days before. And then the emergency response will kind of span between, what we're doing to make sure that we're ready to respond to that, whether that's, for example, if it was flooding, maybe we have to do some flood barrier deployables and things of that nature. So a lot of that is going to take place prior to the onset of the event. And then during the event, crews are out and they're also trying to mitigate the impacts of whatever the hazard may be. And then after it, they're also leading the charge with making sure we get back to some form of normalcy. This takes a lot of interdepartment coordination. So oftentimes, you know, uh, if there was a major event, our emergency operations center is activated. We'll have representatives from almost every department here, as well as some non-government agencies. So when you think of like National Grid, Salvation Army, Red Cross, we can have representatives in our office to be able to make sure that information is flowing seamlessly. If we need additional resources or assets sent into the field, we can get that done efficiently and quickly. And we also are tracking all of that on behalf of the city. Public messaging and outreach, that's also part of that what we're doing in the public education side of the house, but we're also making sure that folks know what the hazard is, what resources are available, and what steps they can take to protect themselves and potentially their loved ones. So oftentimes we're letting people know about our emergency notification system called Alert Boston, which you can sign up for at boston.gov/emergency. Okay, if you don't mind throwing that in the chat for me, just so folks don't miss it. And like I said, that goes right into the protective actions. And we always, during the event, are tracking as much as we can, so that way when we do our after action reports, we can capture any lessons learned and any adjustments that we need to make to our plans and any solutions to particular hazards that may impact the city. Next slide, please. So, part of our education outreach, we do have a couple of campaigns. So, the overall preparedness campaign is Ready Boston. It's templated from the FEMA Ready America campaign, but ours is more specific to our city. We also have a Know Your Zone campaign, which is very critical to what we're talking about tonight. Know Your Zone basically encourages residents to know what their hurricane evacuation zone is, especially in the city of Boston. So in the city, we have 3 hurricane evacuation zones, A being the most vulnerable, B being the second most vulnerable, and C being the least vulnerable of those 3 zones. Um, and so we encourage you to go to boston.gov/emergency, where we have an interactive map where you can type in your address and learn which zone you're in. And this is very helpful because if there were to be an evacuation declared, we would, and it was for a hurricane or something like that, we would be calling it out by zone. And we would be expecting people to leave by their zone. So it's very important to know that. We also, last year, in collaboration with the Office of Climate Resilience, launched the first Deployables Day. I think it was the first in the nation. So, giving ourselves a little pat on the back for that. But we're looking forward to the second edition of that, which is now going to be October 9th. It was supposed to be September 25th, but we got rained out. So, we hope that everyone is able to join us on October 9th. It will be a resource fair. You'll get to engage with a bunch of different flood vendors and city resources, and there'll be food there. So we hope that you're able to come down. It's from 11 to 3 on October 9th at City Hall Plaza. Next slide, please. So this is kind of like the timeline that we use for storm response. So 96 hours prior, we're watching the forecast. We're monitoring National Weather Service, and we also have some other private entities that we use to help us monitor that. We're also trying to get the latest projections, updates on storms, so that way we're kind of starting to prep our briefing for internal communication, which would typically happen about 48 hours prior. And we reach out to individual departments on potential impacts to their operations, so that way we're able to plan for that. 24 hours out, we're taking preventative measures. This could be cleaning out catch basins in flood-prone areas, depending on what our capacity is. Protective actions are also being announced and taken. So damage to assets is minimized through short-term measures such as deployable flood walls. And then we also have the emergency response, whether that's evacuation, or rescue in the event of severe inundation. Next slide, sorry. So, as I mentioned, we do house all of the emergency plans. So we're always looking to improve those plans and make sure that they are as efficient and realistic as possible. Um, But some things that we've been doing over the last couple years is partnering with different vendors to bring different resources to the city. So there are flood sensors, both inland and in our coast, to allow us to track that. I think Stone Living Lab, shout out to them. I think we have a partnership with them as well. But it really helps us to get the most accurate data and really have real time um, information on what's going on and how different storms are impacting our cities, so we can address that. We're also developing tools for emergency response, damage assessment, and recovery efforts, to further help us do our part. So that pretty much, I think, wraps it up for me, but happy to take any questions when we reach that time. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Kairon. So for this decade's storms, basically we're looking at Climate Ready Boston was looking at three different time horizons, 2030, 2050, and 2070. And so for this decade's storms, we're trying to look at how we can address 2030 flood pathways. So what needs to be done immediately for either an interim deployables plan or an ongoing project that we can work on to make it part of our resilient coastal flood protection system. So just to kind of walk through a few projects. Piers Park 1 and 2 were completed in 2023. Piers Park 2 most recently by Massport along the East Boston waterfront. So that's something that's been completed in recent years that addresses the 2030 flood pathway. We also have Resilient Border Street, which is a project led by the City Office of Climate Resilience. It was kicked off in 2024, and it's working with private landowners to develop coastal infrastructure along the Border Street area and look at closing one of those regional short-term flood pathways. The project was started in 2024, and the city is working through concepts with property owners. And so we expect to have an update to share with community members later this year. We also have the Resilient Bennington Street and Fredericks Park project, which is up near the Belle Isle Marsh area. And that is a project being led by the City of Boston in partnership with the City of Revere. That project was started in late 2023 through a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant program. And just this past summer, they reached their 50% design milestone. So now the cities of Revere and and Boston in East Boston are working with Mass DOT to continue leading that design effort. Um, Back down to the south side of East Boston, the Lewis Mall and Carlton Wharf project is being led by the Boston Planning Department Res Coastal Delivery Team. So this project was initially kicked off in 2021, but recently advanced this past summer with some FEMA hazard mitigation grant program funding. So this project is continuing to work on advancing design documents, and I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat for everyone to see some of these more specific project links so that if you want, you can click to learn a little bit more about them. Oops, there you go. But these are all examples of projects that we have already in progress. Then that leads us to beyond 2030. And how are we going to work together with other city agencies, other state partners to advance the remaining mileage of our 47-mile coastline? And this is where our partnership with the U.S. Army Corps is really critical to helping us turn some of these planning projects, some of these items that haven't been started yet, to turn these into the next steps of design and eventually construction. So why now and why U.S. Army Corps? The U.S. Army Corps has a specific charge that they are authorized through Congress to perform on behalf of the federal interest, which is defined by protecting homes, critical infrastructure, and evacuation corridors. So we in the city of Boston share that same interest with the Army Corps. We are also interested in protecting homes. We're interested in protecting our critical infrastructure, as well as making sure that people can safely move around the city before an event and that emergency management teams can move about the city during an event. However, we're a little different in where our process happens. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a specific process that they follow for being able to design, evaluate, compare projects. And this process is the one we are currently in. So the partnership was started in 2022, and we're about halfway through this process. But ultimately, us being able to work with the Army Corps, work towards this first milestone of having our feasibility study completed in 2028 will allow us to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to unlock up to 65% of funding match for being able to design and construct these flood protection structures. So just to kind of step back, and Chris Osgood mentioned this a little bit at the beginning of our meeting, to date, what we've done with the Army Corps is been able to bring them up to speed with the Climate Ready Boston neighborhood plans to define the risk of inaction or what the future without a project intervention by the Army Corps of Engineers would be. And really working through their specific process for making sure they collect all the data and get their coastal modeling set up. Where we are today, this year and next year, is really defining where we would want to have Army Corps layouts, thinking about the design of these systems, and then pairing it with the tools in the toolkit to be able to understand how we can maximize protection from coastal flood risk while also being able to meet our city vision goals for our harbor waterfront, such as public access, being able to maintain our community identity and culture, and also being able to enjoy our harbor walk. So what we will do next after this study is completed is be able to submit that report to Congress in 2028, where it will go to the next step of authorization and funding. So before we get into the locations and the details on what's in the toolkit, this is just a reminder slide to let everyone know that when we talk about the areas, the where, or the what, the tools in the toolbox, these are still very early concepts through the U.S. Army Corps team, and that we still have a long way to go to be able to build these long-term tools. And that's why we're really focusing on that 2070 and beyond planning time horizon with the Army Corps of Engineers, because it will take us time to work through the Army Corps process to be able to design and then build these items. So with that, I'm going to pause and turn over to our program manager with the Army Corps of Engineers, Jeff Herzog.
Thanks, Kate. Can I get a sound check before we get started?
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Herzog. As Kate pointed out, I am a plan formulator, community planner, as well as program manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers New England District. Our office is up in Concord, Massachusetts, if you're familiar with that area up by Minuteman Park and the bridge. On behalf of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, the Honorable Adam Tell, who's been in the job now for about 7 weeks, as well as our Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General Butch Graham, my North Atlantic Division Commander, Colonel Jesse Curry, who sits in New York, but manages the entire New England region, as well as my commander, Colonel Justin Pavis, who is in Concord, Massachusetts, and is responsible for the Corps of Engineers military and civil works projects throughout all 6 New England states. Thank you for taking time out of your night. So a couple of things up front. First of all, the Patriots won. It's always a good week when the Patriots won. Luckily, the Red Sox have already clinched at least the number 5 seed. So tonight's game is in the bottom of the second. Last time I checked, still scoreless against the Yankees. But we should be able to maintain attention for at least the next 45 minutes or so as we're waiting for that game to progress. But in all seriousness, thank you for taking the time tonight to participate in this meeting. And what I'd like you to take away is this is truly just the start of the conversation. This is not the only conversation, and this is not the we're breaking ground tomorrow conversation. This is truly our opportunity to discuss with you the hazards that we see, the authority that we have to address the hazards, how it fits into the whole of government response to community resilience, and what does our part with our partnership with the City of Boston look like? And then we'll talk a little bit about where do some of our alignments and locations line up with what the City of Boston has been looking at for the last decade. What I want you to understand is the Climate Ready Boston was really the launching point for this study. So hats off to Mayor Wu, Chief Climate Officer Brian Sweat, Chris Osgood for the last 10 years of effort in this process. Really, it has been a launching point for this study, and it's not intended to just redo everything, but it's intended to take it to the next step and get something to Congress so that we can really start construction and get a system implemented. So Kate, we'll go to the next slide. You heard me mention how we're just one piece of that resilience puzzle, right? And I like to describe it as a puzzle because if you don't have all the pieces in the right order and in the right location, you might end up with a picture, but it could be a really awkward picture, or you could end up with significant gaps in that picture. So let's think about resilience as a puzzle, and then let's think about the Corps of Engineers as just one piece of that puzzle. Are we a big piece? Maybe. Are we an expensive piece? Possibly, depending as to what your opinion or thoughts on it. It doesn't really matter from that perspective because we all agree that we are a piece of the puzzle. But who else is a piece of the puzzle? The state of Massachusetts. They're currently working on a large-scale metropolitan watershed study with the Corps of Engineers and the state EEA office. But also the city of Boston is moving forward, as you heard from Kate earlier, talking about some of those resilience projects with Boston Planning and Bennington Street and some things over on Border Street, Pierce Park, Langone Park, Pupilo Park. Those areas are beautiful locations that maybe this is the first time you heard that those are actually flood control features. Those are features in order to increase community resilience. So it's that whole of government approach. But we're also working with Massport, we're working with Mass DOT, we're working with Boston Water Sewer Commission, because if we don't tackle this from a whole of government approach, then we end up in a situation where we're struggling to tie the system together and you're potentially creating weak points. So that's why it's important to have this conversation tonight. It's because you all, as the community and as the stakeholders within the community, are a vital piece of this puzzle. Not only do you have a responsibility in the community resilience puzzle, but you have a voice. The intent is this system, like many other systems across the nation and across the world, over the next 50 to 100 years, will become a part and a piece of the identity of the community. So not only is it going to provide resilience, but like Langone Park and Pierce Park, it's going to be an integrated piece of fabric of the character within this community. And so in order to do that, we need your input and we want your input. So if you come out of here tonight understanding that we're not breaking ground tomorrow, but we do need your input, that's going to be vital. And so a couple of questions I want you to think about as I'm going through this presentation. Number one, what if we do nothing? What is your greatest concern if we do nothing tonight? The second question is the complete opposite. What is your greatest concern if we do something? If we do recommend a plan, what is your concern? Those are the two things that we really want to pull some information from you, because the reality is if I put 20 of you in a room, I'm going to get 20 different solutions. We're all looking at the same information, but we see different information. And what I mean by that is based off of Where do you live within East Boston? What do you do for work within East Boston? Are you a stakeholder, or are you just a resident? Are you a hourly wage worker, or are you a contractor? All of these things are going to help you develop how you see this information and what you recommend. So if I put 20 of you in a room, I've got at least 18 different solutions. Some of them are going to be similar, but they're all going to differ in some way. So it's not necessarily a matter of what do you want and I'm going to build it that way. It's a matter of how can we integrate this system into a piece of the fabric of this community moving into the future. In order to do that, we have to understand that we're looking at different hazards. So Climate Ready Boston, and as well as coastal resilience initiatives from the city at the state level, as well as any other kind of regional or wharf district plan, or Belle Isle Marsh, Friends of Belle Isle Marsh, Mystic River Watershed Association. They're all great, but they're looking and focusing on the hazard. We're doing the same thing. We are authorized to evaluate coastal storm risks. Now, as part of the coastal storm risk, science is showing us, and if you look at your tidal data over the last 40 years, you will see a trend in the sea level change that is showing that it is increasing. Not to mention, as Kate pointed out earlier, quite a bit of Boston was constructed on fill. Why? Because you needed to get the land out to deeper water so that you could get your maritime navigation. Well, that's now subsiding because they weren't considering how long this land would have to be in use and occupied, and how heavy our structures and our buildings would become in the future. So we have sea level change. That is the rise with the sea levels, but it's also the subsidation with the land itself. But you also have storm surge. Riley and Grayson are two perfect examples of that, in which you have just straight walls of water coming in, and it's wind driven and it's tidal driven here because of the fact that you have an 11-foot tide swing. So all of these things feed that hazard. And then you have, of course, wave action and erosion. Now, here in the city of Boston, you don't have a lot of 30-foot wide, quarter-mile wide beaches like you would see in like Wildwood, New Jersey, for example, or if you go down the mid-Atlantic coast, you see these big old wide beaches. And so they have a lot of erosion issues. You're built right up to the coastal edge in many areas, especially here in, you can look at Constitution Beach, but then you look at many of the other areas and you have built right up to the coastal edge. And it's for good reason. A, community cohesion. B, you're a maritime navigation and working waterfront community. So it makes perfect sense to have done what you've done. And so when we look at wave action and erosion, that's not the primary hazard that we're facing here in East Boston or in the most of the Boston communities. What we are facing is that storm surge. And so if you look, I just want to highlight that flood pathway arrow, because if we go to the next slide, this is going to show you, next slide, there we go. This is going to show you probably a somewhat familiar site. This is going to show you the flood pathways into the East Boston community, as well as the blue is the inundation. Now, this inundation is from our coastal model, the coastal hazard system, but it uses the same foundational information. It's called ADCIRC. And what it is ours is a life cycle model, similar to what the Woods Hole group did within the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model. And that model has been adopted by the entire region. It's not just Massachusetts, it's not just the city of Boston. Woods Hole group's model is pretty much accepted across the region. Our model is slightly different. However, what you won't see is significant differences in the floodplain itself. So this is what your floodplain looks like in the inundation at approximately a 1%. I don't like to say 100-year event, because when it happens more than once a year over a 100-year period, or if it happens every 2 years, well then, how does that make sense to call it a 100-year event? So we call it a 1% probability of exceeding event. And then you see, of course, the black arrows. Those black arrows are all the different flood entry pathways. So this is the hazard that we're looking at. We're looking at storm surge, wind-driven range, tidally influenced range, sea level change influence, surge. And then we're looking at how do we reduce that risk? Well, when we talk about the term risk, you have to understand, well, what is our federal interest? And Kate touched on it briefly, but if we go to the next slide. A little slow on my end. There we go. Federal interest, if we're going to reduce risk within our federal interest, we have to consider protection of housing, protection of evacuation, protection of critical infrastructure. Those are all things that Kate mentioned earlier. But we have additional missions and we have additional requirements. Protection of natural resources. Prime example of that, and I'm a fan of Aldo Leopold, Shannon County Almanac, 1949. I mean, 1949, we were already talking about this, that if you don't balance your development with your protection of natural resources, that's how you end up with invasive species. That's how you end up with introduced species that actually end up becoming invasive species. That's how you end up with lack of green space and community gathering spaces. That's how you end up with unavoidable heat consequences. So we very much have a responsibility to look at the protection of those natural resources, as well as protection of critical transportation. It's easy to say that critical transportation is also critical infrastructure, but it really has to go down to that next level of socioeconomic impacts and the social impacts of not protecting critical infrastructure. So if I don't protect the Blue Line in East Boston, all right, all of those people who need to get from East Boston to downtown or East Boston to South Boston in order to go to work. If I shut down the Blue Line, that means they need to either find alternate transportation or they get to fight traffic through the Ted Williams Tunnel. Good luck with that. I've seen it when the Blue Line's running great and it's a struggle. So I could just imagine what happens when the Blue Line's not running. And if somebody misses out on 2 or 3 days of work, what does that do for a month's worth of rent? What does that do for a week's worth of groceries? So it's about taking these impacts and taking it down to that next level, social impacts, socioeconomic impacts, and looking at it from a regional economic perspective. Those are all within the federal interest. So if we're going to talk about now the risk, you have to understand that a hazard in and of itself may not be a hazard. It could be an opportunity. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk about risk. This is the only math lesson I'm going to give you tonight, I promise. However, risk equals the probability of an event or a hazard times the consequence of the hazard. All right. And here's just a quick diagram to show you. So if it's a low probability but a high consequence or high impact, then it might be a medium level risk. If it's a low probability and low impact, it's probably a low risk. But what if it's a high probability with a low impact? And we see that every king tide now along Long Wharf and along other portions, probably creeping up towards Border Street and those other areas that we're looking at, the marsh impacts, et cetera. So those are still medium level risks. And then of course you have those high probability, high impact events, Grayson, Riley, and those are those high risk. So as we're looking at managing risk, we have to identify what are we trying to reduce and by how much do we need to reduce it for it to be acceptable, because that's going to help us identify what tools do we want to use in our toolbox. So let's go to the next slide. So tools in the toolbox, right? The first level, that top level, it says it's red, green, amber. You know, don't look at the color. Just understand when we're talking about structural measures, we are talking about reducing the probability within the equation of risk. So if we reduce the probability is lower, multiply that by the consequence, you're going to get a lower risk. All right. And so by reducing this, by protecting or building something structurally, what we're saying is we are going to alter the hydrologic flow of the water. And that's how we're going to reduce the probability of the flood from impacting that particular portion of the community where the measure is constructed. However, if we don't alter the hydrologic flow of the water, but we say elevate a structure, or we put in stop logs, or we construct parapet walls to protect a tunnel, we're not changing the flow of the water. However, we are changing the consequence level. We are reducing the risk by reducing the inundation to that particular area. So we call those non-structural measures. They're still physical, but they reduce the consequence piece of the equation. There's an example of that there. There's a third drawer here, and this is an area where I really want to give credit to the city of Boston in its being forward-leaning. And if you're a developer or a contractor or you're trying to build a home, this probably annoys you a little bit because of the permitting process and the zoning process. But understand, there's good reason behind it. And it's because the science is saying we need to take these precautions. And this drawer is that non-structural, non-physical approach. And that's managing the risk by potentially eliminating the structures in that particular area. So again, I want to give credit to the city of Boston because in a lot of the areas, they are already starting to kind of look forward and look into doing this approach. So let's go to the next slide. How does this apply to East Boston specifically? Well, we're going to look at what provides the maximum level of protection. How much of a risk is this particular reach within East Boston facing? All right. And then once we identify that, well, we have to look at what is possible to build based off of space constraints, based off of acceptability, based off of environmental impact, all of these things. What is actually even constructible in this area? And then we have to ask ourselves, well, we can build it and it would provide this level of protection, but is it really appropriate for this area? And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the best fit for East Boston? And it's going to look a little bit different throughout all of East Boston, just like East Boston looks a little bit different than across the rest of the Boston Harbor coastline. And so I'm going to pause here. I think if we go to the next slide, it should be a blue slide telling me to pause for, oh, no, I'm sorry. Let's pause for questions here and just ask, do we have any questions about what risk means or why we're taking the approach that we're taking?
So if you have a question, you can use the reaction to raise your hand now, and I will call on you. Or you can type your question into the chat, and we can repeat it and then get the answer to you. Also, just a plug that if you don't have a question at the moment, but you want to use the chat to ask them, you can. And at the next pause, I will queue those up for Jeff and for myself to help answer.
Kathy, I see your hand up. Oh, you'll need to come up and
ask you to
Kathy.
unmute. There you go.
Sorry about that. Hi, how are you? Thank you for these presentations.
Good, how are you doing?
Good. I had wanted to ask last week, and so I wanted to make sure I got it in this week. At Boston Harbor now, so we're as interested in getting people to the harbor as protecting people from it, and wondering how the solutions that you are going to be proposing are going to address that issue, and if you can give us some examples, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so, and we're actually going to talk about that. Well, let's just jump to the next slide, and we'll skip to the end of the story. We understand community connectivity is quite important. It's definitely one of our metrics. We also understand that it's a working waterfront. So even if it's not ecotourism and getting people to the water, it's also connecting people to the water for employment purposes, for maritime navigation purposes, for transportation purposes with all of the ferry access and everything. So all of those are very important. And those are all planning considerations. And so we have to be very careful about where are we recommending an outboard solution or a seaward solution that could potentially either require a fill or it could require blocking access temporarily or permanent to the waterfront. And so those are some areas where we're still wrapping our arms around where those areas are and what those areas look like and where is the compromise in order to address the hazard. And so what is appropriate for Border Street and the DPA in that area may not be appropriate for, say, further up along Chelsea Creek or in another location in East Boston. And so I wish I could give you the perfect answer, Kathy, but I can tell you that not only is Boston Harbor now, but but all of the other stakeholders in the area made sure to remind us how important that consideration is in making our recommendations.
Appreciate that, Jeff. Thanks.
And if I could just add to what you just said, Jeff, I also just want to say that the work that we are doing with the Army Corps is still subject to all of our Commonwealth of Massachusetts regulations and laws that we have in place for public access. So because we have Chapter 91, Harbor Walk and public access requirements as part of our uh, state laws and regulations, that the Army Corps is still also needing to build within those same current regulations. So that's just something else that we are working with as a city and prioritize as well. And also working with the Corps to be able to identify those opportunities for collaboration.
Thanks,
Do you
Kate.
want to keep?
So
Absolutely.
I want to, since Kathy mentioned it, and we're on the slide, let's kind of go through what do some of these toolkits, tools in the toolbox look like, and these were presented in Climate Ready Boston, and quite frankly, they're great tools, they're great visuals, and there's no reason for us to change what's working. The locations may change a little bit, the elevations may change a little bit, but generally speaking, we would recommend very similar tools to what they recommended in Climate Ready Boston. So what you see here in the upper left is that raised harbor walk. As Kate mentioned, there's a Chapter 91 state required harbor walk throughout a good deal of the project location. Even here in East Boston, even where you may not even think there is a Chapter 91 harbor walk, over by Boulder Street by Shaw's, there's a Chapter 91 harbor walk over there. And so being able to just integrate our system into that system and into that feature would not only provide resilience and provide protection, but it would also provide access to that waterfront. Now, there are certain locations where you'd have a raised harbor walk, but then you have a driveway that you have to cross. And so maybe you can change the grade of that entry pathway, or maybe you can't. You have to put a vertical flood wall or a closure structure, something along those lines. Or maybe you are already constructed all the way up to the water's edge and you don't have real estate in order to construct a raised harbor walk. And so you need to, in certain locations, there's just no ands, ifs, or buts about it. If you're going to deliver the level of protection that you need to based off of the hazard and the risk, you could require a vertical flood wall. Now, can we bury that vertical flood wall and give it a sloped face in order to allow for some natural processes to still occur rather than having the direct wave reflection and surge reflection off of that vertical surface and exacerbating erosion? Absolutely. But at the core, at the foundation, it's still just a vertical flood wall. Well, what if you backfill behind that vertical flood wall, and then that vertical flood wall becomes a ADA accessible handrail in the future? Absolutely. It's still at the foundation, a vertical flood wall. So those are all those conversations that we have to identify. If we need a vertical flood wall, what is the appropriate elevation and what is the appropriate integration technique into the community so that it becomes a piece of the character? Langone Park, if you go over there, over by the bocce ball and the softball fields, you see those beautiful benches. You know what's behind those beautiful benches and below them? It's a flood wall. It's a vertical surface. And so that's hats off to the city of Boston and to the consultants that they work with, because in 10 years, people will completely forget that it was a flood control project. So it's a beautiful way to integrate the features in. Raised berms and dunes. Dunes, there isn't a significant sand source, and it's going to be really challenging in order to construct sands and dunes. However, Rogues Point in Revere is an example of where we could potentially have that. So we're not saying no, but we're likely saying not here, not now, not appropriate. And then we got raised berms. Raised berms, if you have sufficient real estate. Now, something to consider with raised berms and dunes is it's great because it's a shallow foundation and you don't have to worry about water getting up underneath your feature and causing erosion and then causing weak points behind it. So if you go with a shallow foundation, you need space. I'm going to use this as an example because we're going to talk about it later. If you go over to Jeffrey's Point, DCR did a beautiful revetment over there. But you know what's on top of that revetment? Trees. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right. But what I am saying is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers safety policy will not allow us to plant trees directly on top of a raised berm and a dune. So then the question has to be, do we really want berms and dunes, or do we want to take a smaller footprint with a vertical flood wall, bury that vertical flood wall, very similar to if you walk through Washington, D.C., and you go through the National Mall. It's absolutely beautiful. But you know what? As you're walking past the Vietnam Memorial and as you're walking past the 17th Street opening, those are vertical flood walls that are buried in grass. It's a great way to reduce your footprint, but still have that level of protection that you need. I just want to highlight here adapted buildings and structures. World Trade Center Boston is a great example of it, as well as Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital in the Charlestown area. If you want to go check out what building adaptation looks like in real time, hats off to those facilities. Next slide. All right, there's two examples to just kind of give you a little bit of a visualization. One is in your backyard. About 45 to 50 minutes south of you, no traffic, an hour and a half with traffic. But that's New Bedford, Massachusetts, and that is the storm surge barrier that's now. That is an extremely large barrier system. And what I want you to understand is I'm not necessarily recommending that feature for you. Why? Because that's a hurricane storm surge barrier, whereas the city of Boston is looking at storm surge associated with extratropical and nor'easters. Could you have an event similar to like a Hurricane Bob that actually does come in to Boston Harbor? Potentially, but your everyday risk and your greatest threat is those extratropical nor'easters that you see 3 to 5 times a year. And as we move into the future with sea level change, you're going to see significantly higher water surface elevation. So that's just an example of what a recreation feature on top of that feature might look like. Another thing, and this is in design for implementation now in Norfolk, Virginia. It's our sister district in the Norfolk area, but they've got a CSRM project, and this is an elevated harbor walk. It's a trail on top of their flood wall, their seawall. Now, the reason I want to show you this picture is because you see here, and maybe you can read it, maybe you can't, but it says USACE pump station. Now, we are not suggesting that we need a New Orleans type pump station that we're pumping thousands of CFS, cubic feet per second, stormwater out. That is not what we're saying. But what we are saying is we have to work with Boston Water Sewer Commission. And we have to identify, if we build something, how does that impact stormwater and interior drainage? Because again, if we're not working with our partners, then we are creating a system that is only partially successful. And so there is a very good possibility, if we construct a wall or a structural feature along the coastline, that we are going to have a way to evacuate water when that system is activated. And so that could very well be a pump station. Maybe it's a storage basin. Maybe it's just gravity fed with different gates in order to keep the storm water out. And there's all sorts of different options. But this is an example here where they had to utilize a pump station. And there could be areas in across Boston where we need that pump station. Next slide. All right, this is an example of what I had mentioned with the harbor walk, and then you have the wall. Now, if you see this, you would think to yourself, well, how does that completely disconnects me from the water? This particular feature in this particular reach, they designed it this way for a reason. But if you look, it's gradually going up and it's going down. So up here, it's filled in behind it. So what does it look like here for the city of Boston? We don't know. We also aren't, generally speaking, looking at 9-foot walls. We're probably looking closer to 3 to 6 foot walls. So again, 3 to 6 foot walls, you either have an ADA accessible handrail, or you backfill behind it and you have an ADA accessible handrail, or you bury it and create a sloped face with a recreational trail on top. There's so many different options for us to work with the city of Boston. But the idea is, due to space, they had to go with a flood wall here. And this one's really neat. This is a really neat picture, because if I were to buy this house without ever seeing the original one, I would think that's a beautiful house, and it looks like it was old, and it looks like, you know, this is originally how they built it. But really, in fact, what this is a house that's been elevated. So the basement's been filled in. or if it's slab on grade, the entire grade has kind of been lifted, and it's elevated underneath it. Now, if you are familiar with a lot of beach projects in the mid-Atlantic or in the Gulf Shores, you probably see them up on stilts. Stilts is not the only answer. This is another option, and this could be more appropriate if we were to elevate some residential structures in East Boston, or Port Norfolk is another example over in the Dorchester community where you could see something like this. Next slide. I appreciate everybody's patience. I want to kind of pause here and talk real quick on tools and see if there's any questions. All right, I also I need to give my interpreters a break because I'm speaking 1,000 words per minute. Octavio, Carlos, if I can just get a thumbs up that you guys are good. Maybe you need a sip of water. All right. Hey, thanks, guys. I realize I speak fast. And even after reminding myself constantly, I'm still guilty of it. So let's talk about the city of Boston, specifically East Boston. Next slide.
I was going to say, this is your break now, Jeff. I was just going to give a little bit of context for how we would like your help today. So just a reminder, we're going to go through the locations. We're going to be able to talk through what Army Corps is looking at right now. We have the opportunity to have a preliminary draft review of the location for some of the layouts that they're proposing for our Boston Coastal Storm Risk Management Study. So we'd love to hear your questions, your concerns, and we'd also like to ask for your help with a few questions. Did we miss any areas? When it comes to risk assessment or protection, what is important to you that we should know about either the tools that are in the toolkit or the locations that we have currently selected as our preliminary draft locations. And for me in particular, in service to the city, I would love to know how I can help make this process more accessible to you, um, because I want to help understand who else I can reach out to. I'd love to come to your community association meeting if that's something that would be helpful for you. I'd love to be able to come and meet you in the community to be able to do a site walk, if that's something that is important or you would find valuable. So just some items to keep in mind as we kind of go through the rest of our presentation. I also want to share what we're going to be doing next with the information that we do collect. We're going to today, as best we can, give you answers to your questions. These presentation slides are posted on our website, so I'm going to go ahead and put the links to those in the chat. We have those in English and in Spanish. We're going to meet with you hopefully in person or over video to learn more about your questions or concerns. So I'll share the link in a moment for how you can stay in touch with us and provide feedback. But we also want to report back to you later this year. So before the end of the calendar year, we will be providing a look back at the feedback and report out on what we heard this year. This is the third neighborhood that we've been able to work with. We do have South Boston scheduled to be followed by the downtown and North End conversation. But these are just a few ways that you can continue to stay in the loop and learn more about how to stay involved. So again, before I get into locations, I also just want to clarify that the locations that cross over with areas that we have already evaluated and started work on as an outcome of Climate Ready Boston neighborhood level planning, these projects are still in progress, and that the Army Corps planning is meant to be one option, not the only option for when we get to construction of these projects. So just to kind of show on the screen the projects I had mentioned earlier, Border Street and Bennington Street in Fredericks Park, which are being led by the City of Boston Office of Climate Resilience, and in the Fredericks Park case, also the City of Revere. And then our Lewis Mall and Carlton Wharf process being led by the Boston Planning Coastal Delivery Team. These are all projects that are going to continue to progress. We're going to continue to keep working on design. And ultimately, we as the city have the opportunity to explore what's known as a locally preferred plan when it comes to final design and final alignments. But just a reminder that when turn it back over to Jeff, we're just walking through, these are the preliminary drafts that we have selected as locations for Army Corps, and they do cross over with several of our projects that we're already working on. So with that, back to you, Jeff.
Awesome. So I want to highlight a question that came up in the chat. And the question was, what are the actual build times for the different measures, i.e. construction start to finish? And so that's a wonderful question. I wish I could give you a perfect, straightforward answer, and I'm not going to try and tap dance too much. But what I will say is as part of building this plan, we have to understand how are we going to phase it. If it's $1 million plan, $1 billion plan, or a multi-million-dollar plan, or a multi-billion-dollar plan, right? There is an understanding that we're going to have to construct it in a particular order, and we're going to have to construct it using a phased approach. And so understanding that will help us to understand what features are we going to construct and how long those features are going to take to construct. If I have to construct a wall in a dense urban environment, it's going to take longer because of the excavation necessary and maneuvering around buildings as well as production rates. Whereas if I have to build a shallow foundation berm in an area that has a lot of laydown area and open space, it could go quicker. And so understanding what the feature is, where the feature is going, and how are we going to be able to construct it is really going to drive those construction times. So you could be looking at months to years to multiple years. What we're assuming now for our just estimations is that if we start construction in 2030, 2032, 2033, somewhere in that time frame based off of when we finish the study, we would have the entire system, 47 miles of coastline system, constructed no later than 2040. And so that means pieces of the system will be constructed within a couple of years, but then other larger pieces or pieces that are funded at a later date may not be fully constructed until 2040. That's why it's so important that you hear the city talking about we're leaning forward in Border Street, we're leaning forward at Bennington Street, is because they recognize these are near-term immediate risks. And if you're waiting for the Corps of Engineers to come in and construct something in 2040 for a threat or a hazard that's already real in 2030 or in 2025, then we're 5-10 years too late. So hats off to the city for that. And I apologize that I can't give you a perfect answer, but I do want to highlight the fact that, you know, we are considering all of this as we're moving forward. Now, the other question that probably just popped into your mind, wait a minute. If the city's already constructing this, well, then are you going to tear it up? No, we're not going to tear it up. It's important for us to be working with the city so that we can integrate all of their system and their features into our larger system so that it's a comprehensive system of features. Similar to what you see happening across the nation in other areas where it's no longer just piecemeal Band-Aid fixes. We're taking a deliberate approach to building a system. So if the city is building it today, it's either going to be adaptable to what we need in the future, or we're going to be able to tie directly into it. So again, hats off to the city for taking that forward-leaning approach, as well as being such a crucial and vocal partner with us so that we can continue to make sure that our system is integrated and comprehensive. All right. I want to highlight here.
Can I interrupt to add to that quick, Jeff?
Sure.
Just real quick, I also wanted to shout out to, we are working with several state and local stakeholders that are also thinking about or currently doing capital projects, or they're doing construction projects also in some of the same areas. So as part of our U.S. Army Corps partnership, Jeff and I are also working closely with our other stakeholders like the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, or MassDOT, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR, Massport, who is one of the partners that might also have projects going on in the East Boston area as well as all along the coastline, and partners that might be private developers or other folks that are already working on plans along the waterfront in East Boston as well as citywide. So there's a lot of projects that my goal is to prevent any project from needing to be uh, taken down or changed or removed. My goal is to be proactive in how we are addressing all of the work that we, the city, are leading, as well as others, to build coastal resilience across the waterfront. So it's city-led and beyond.
Thanks, Kate. Just so we're tracking, as I go through these, I'm going to be spending more time focusing on those areas that really don't necessarily fit in the near-term immediate plans that the city's already working on. So as we look at Bennington Street, or if we're looking at Border Street or Lewiston, the Wharf, those areas line up very similar to what the city's already doing, and the city's already moving forward with it. And so those are very likely kind of going to be the same plan, for lack of a better term. I want to focus on areas where I need your input, we need your input, but also where there may be some different options for us to look at as far as features go or as far as location goes. As you'll see here, we'll drill down into these. Next slide. All right, looking at the Chelsea Creek side of East Boston over here, and you'll see Route 1A. You're probably familiar with it. Some of that traffic area is pretty dense over there. So there's one option where we can construct along the median for Route 1A. So first of all, you've got construction impacts, right? And you're going to have road impacts and traffic impacts from just the construction itself. Not to mention, do you end up losing a lane of traffic? We don't know. But if we take that approach, that could be a consideration. Another consideration is the fact that you still have these structures seaward of that Route 1A. And so if you were to construct that, would you have to do building adaptations over here? But there is a Mass DOT railway easement over here. And so could we, working with Mass DOT as well as the city of Boston, construct something along the coastal edge over here? Maybe it's an elevated harbor walk recreation trail. Maybe it's a vertical wall. Maybe it's a revetment of some sort. We don't know yet, but we do know that if we utilize that coastal edge solution, it needs to be a little bit longer in order to cut off that flood pathway. And it's likely going to be a little bit more expensive. Does that exceed the Route 1A option? We don't know yet, but we want to just get your input. What do you think if we were to take either one of these approaches, benefits or impacts? The other piece I want to talk about over here, Joe, go ahead.
No, Jeff, please finish. When you're done with the slide, I just had a question.
Sure. So when we originally looked at this, all right, you got the Orient Heights natural ground in this area. And then on the other side, you got Suffolk Downs. You're probably familiar with it. And we understand there's potentially some redevelopment plans over there. It's neither here nor there. But what I can tell you is on the other side of that, you have an area of critical environmental concern in the Belle Isle Marsh area. I've done some master's work on that, and it's a very important resource as it's one of the last remaining and largest urban salt marshes in the New England region. However, when we looked at long-term, so this is different than the Bennington Street project that the city is currently working on. When we looked at long-term flood risk in this area, we realized that we would not be able to address this risk unless we took it on a much larger watershed level and looked at all the way up to the Saugus River and all the way over through Rogues Point and Revere Beach. And so there are flood pathways that come in there, and they go all the way across to Chelsea Creek, and they come all the way down here. And so in order for us to address those, it's going to require a much larger effort. So in the meantime, we have to address the immediate risk. The city's looking at their Bennington Street project for the near-term flood pathway. And then for the longer-term flood pathway, it would require some sort of cutoff here. Thanks for putting your cursor on that. Right there near that, somewhere in the vicinity of the Suffolk Downs, where we could tie into high ground on both sides. And so that would be necessary in order to protect this absolutely vital, and I think everyone would agree, vital Orient Heights rail yard down here. And so this Orient Heights rail yard is that kind of rectangle that you see peninsula here. And so regardless of what your feelings are about whether they should keep it there, whether they should move it, or whether it should be part of a different study or different effort, that's neither here nor there, and I respect everyone's opinion. But for us, this is a piece of critical infrastructure, and it's a piece of critical transportation infrastructure that many people, 54% of the community here in East Boston utilizes public transportation to get to work every day. And this is a vital piece of that transportation network. So we need to protect that. And then, of course, now we have Constitution Beach. We kind of talked about beaches and dunes a little bit. But this area, actually, we're looking at setting it further back. And by setting it further back on the other side of the parking lot, if you're familiar with Constitution Beach, by setting it further back, it gives us the opportunity to allow for those more natural processes to occur, whether it's accretion on the beach or whether it is reduced erosion risk because you don't have such a steep slope face. And so we're looking at setting back there and then, of course, tying in. Now, if you live in this Constitution Beach neighborhood right here, all right, we need to talk to you, and we want to talk to you. We want your input so that way we can understand, A, what are you seeing today, but B, understand how can we integrate a line of protection here that protects not only you, but protects the community behind you, because that's what our mission is right? To manage the risk of coastal storms to not only residential, but also to the blue line that's back here and to the roads and to the Suffolk Downs station and the Orient Heights station that's right up in this area. And then as we move a little bit further down, you start getting into the Wood Island Marsh, and we're looking at different shallow foundation options and lines of protection that would reduce or manage risk in this particular area. Again, along the blue line, but also that kind of critical Orient Heights area, and some great restaurants. Let me tell you, I love going to East Boston and in this area and having lunch or dinner. Beautiful community, beautiful people.
And just to
Joe,
highlight,
you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, sure thing. First, Jeff, thanks to you for the thoughtful way in which you continue to approach this project, and obviously to Kate and Chris and Chiron, just really good meetings. So appreciate it, and looking forward to the rest of it. Jeff, both of these questions will be a little familiar to you since I asked them at the library last week, but there's a lot of new people on this call, so just wanted to make sure for clarification for folks. The first one is related to this and the future slides, and then the second is a broader question. So I'll just ask them both and then let you address them. The first one is a red line here doesn't necessarily mean a wall, correct? It means an alignment, and that may be a variety of different approaches. Viewers should not equate the red line to a wall. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. Thank you for pointing that out, Joe. You pointed it out last week, and I still forgot to point it out today. This is indicating an alignment or a location for a feature. What that feature is, it might be a vertical feature, vertical wall that's buried. It might be a vertical wall that's filled in behind it and looks like a sidewalk or a harbor walk. It could be a shallow foundation berm. It could be a shallow foundation road. We have not narrowed that down yet. That's going to be dependent on several things, including environmental impacts to natural resources. It could be what we refer to as Section 106, but it's viewscape and social, cultural, historic, matching the current viewscape. It's also very dependent on real estate. Like I talk about, you see this red line here that goes right next to the Constitution Beach community. Those are people's homes. And that's something that we take very seriously because we want to make sure that we integrate this system to manage risk, but also the 364 days out of the year where it's not, that it's a part of the community's identity. And so real estate is another big consideration. So thanks for pointing that out, Joe.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And then just the broader question is, East Boston and the city as a whole just has incredible natural ecosystems along the coast. And I know you're being very mindful of that. We've talked before, Stone Living Lab has been collaborating with you in Boston Harbor now. But I just want to make sure that folks are sort of aware that you are also coordinating with the Engineering with Nature program in the Army Corps and trying to do the Army Corps' best to really allow those natural ecosystems to continue to do what they do and embrace the nature-based approaches that have been sort of proposed throughout Climate Ready Boston as well. You hit on that a bit, but I just want to ask, is that something that's a priority for the Army Corps?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Joe. And Joe and I both have had the pleasure of working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineering Research Development Center, specifically Engineering with Nature, and that is evaluating nature-based alternatives because nature-based solutions are often more affordable, they're natural, so they're easier to maintain, and a lot of times they're softer, and so they just look more appealing to the visual viewscape. And I would encourage folks to just go on Google and Google Frontier Journal, Google Engineering with Nature, and Google City of Boston case study. I was blessed to be a contributing author on a great article that used this study specifically as a case study for nature-based solutions. And really the thing to highlight there is it depends, what is the hazard that you're trying to address? If you're trying to address erosion, well then beaches and dunes, and that's a great opportunity. If you're trying to address wave attack, or if you're trying to address erosion, maybe a green living levee or a natural feature like that. If you're trying to address a wall of water and storm surge coming in, those may not be the best way to keep water out of the community. You have to take a different approach. But again, whole of government and resilience is a puzzle. If we do build something that keeps the water out of the community, that is not to say that we can't work with or other stakeholders in the city of Boston or the state can't work to develop those softer, greener features that integrate in and maybe even provide a little bit of added protection, like a living levee or a living shoreline at the base of a foundation of something that we construct. That allows for, erosion protection against future scouring. But at the same time, it provides a great opportunity for natural habitat. So there's lots of opportunities either to construct something as part of this project, and maybe if it's not part of this project because it doesn't address the hazard, maybe it's something supplemental to the larger resilience puzzle. So that's a great point, Joe, and I always appreciate, our opportunities to work together on this.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Jeff, I did just put the article in the chat for folks from Dr. Andrew McQueen from the Engineering with Nature program. So I just dropped the U.S. Army Corps Engineering with Nature research page that was based in Belle Isle Marsh habitat.
Wonderful. Thanks. Let's jump to the next slide.
I did want to point out before we left this slide of just partnerships too. So how could I forget MBTA, of course, as we look at the Orient Heights facility, we are working with them as a close partner in this Army Corps partnership. And again, Massport and looking at some of the areas that they might be property owners of and work that they may have ongoing as well. Back to you. Next slide.
Yeah. And I want to be cognizant of time. I'm going to try and wrap up in the next few minutes because I want to leave time for comments or questions and concerns. And so as we get to a couple areas that either had public meetings with the City of Boston, Border Street, Bennington Street already, I may try and breeze through those in order to get to questions, but I don't want you to think those areas are not important in the study area. It's the complete opposite. let's talk about this area, Pertio Park and Jeffries Point. And if you're familiar, well, most of you probably live here, and so you're probably more annoyed by the tourists. But me, I travel in and out of there quite a bit. And when I do come in there, I occasionally have to rent a car. And when I do, I have to go down Tomahawk Drive to the rental car center, right? And so when you go down there to the rental car center, it goes along this beautiful area. But that area is a flood pathway, and it's a flood pathway into the community behind here. And so one thing that we're looking at is how can we manage the risk without increasing other risks. This is Tomahawk Drive. We could take the approach where we come through and we elevate the harbor walk that's along the coastal edge. That's an absolutely viable solution. However, if we do that, we could have significant impacts on these trees right here. So instead of doing that, well, why wouldn't we just come in and just elevate this portion of Tomahawk Drive? The trees get to stay. In 10 years, people forgot what the old road looked like. But at the same time, when the flood comes, it's cut off. So that's just an example of, yes, we could do it this way, but is it the appropriate tool for the community in this location? Now, I mentioned earlier about the revetment. It's a beautiful revetment right here, and then it's got some trees on it. And I'm not saying that, you know, it was the wrong thing to do. I'm definitely not saying that. What I'm saying, though, is our policy, our federal policy, does not allow for any kind of trees within 15 feet of the foundation of our feature at all. And so that's not to say they were wrong when they did that, because it looks beautiful, and I'm assured that it's structurally sound. It's just based off of our policy, we wouldn't be able to do it. So in that case, we take that into consideration when we make our recommendation over here, where we elevate the road as opposed to elevating the harbor walk. Now, maybe when we start looking at utilities and everything, it becomes cost prohibitive and execution constructability prohibitive to try and construct that. And then we have to come back and say, okay, well, do we do a buried flood wall? Do we do a vertical flood wall that makes it look like a handrail, or do we elevate the harbor walk? But in the meantime, we have options so long as we cut this flood pathway in here. Likewise, you see that it wraps around here. This is Pertio Park, taking advantage of natural features. And although it may not technically be a nature-based solution, it is engineering with the natural viewscape as opposed to just throwing up a concrete wall and calling it good. So had a great conversation with DCR and really enjoyed touring this area. Next slide. All right, this is Lewis Mall, Carlton Wharf. In fact, I believe there was a public meeting on this last night. And so, you know, I will only touch on a couple things in this area. First of all, the question we have to ask, and the question that we need your help in answering is do we go for the near-term risk, similar to what the city of Boston is already currently working on, or do we need to look at longer-term risk, and rather than making something adaptable, maybe we need to build more robust today? Those are the questions that we have to answer based off of our economic analysis, our natural resource analysis, also our community analysis, to identify what is the appropriate level that we need to try and manage risk to, because based off of that, it's going to drive what features or what tools in the toolkit do we have available in order to address that risk. So in the future, you'll hear us coming out and we'll be asking those questions of you. Well, what if we construct something? What if we don't construct something? Those are those two questions I pointed out at the beginning. And then, of course, we understand that there's the East Boston ferry that already runs in and out of here. So that's another consideration for us based off of our alignment. What is those short-term, long-term impacts to the ferry? Because that's a vital piece of public transportation. It's not just, you know, where tourists go out for whale watching. It's a matter of people trying to get to work and get to the grocery store. So, you know, those are the things that we have to consider. Next slide. Border Street, we have a couple of options. So you got this is a charter school over here. Well, you can't see my cursor. There you go. Thanks, Kate. So this is the charter school over here. And then as you follow that down along the coastline, that's Shaw's. Most of you probably know it because it's where you do your grocery shopping. Why? Because it's the only grocery store in East Boston, unless you go to a different neighborhood. And then as you follow that down, then you start getting into a historic dry dock and then into DPA area, designated port areas. And so it starts getting real complex. How are we going to navigate in there? It's a working waterfront. So maybe it's not appropriate to go all the way along the coastal edge in that area. Maybe it's more appropriate to go over by the historic dry dock area and then cut up near Maverick Street in order to tie into high ground. And you change a little bit of the grade in that area on the sidewalk or the road, and you cut your flood pathways in that way, rather than trying to go all the way around that designated port area and interrupt or disrupt the working waterfront. Excuse me, had a lapse in my mind. And then as you go around the eddy, you've got the park over here, and there's lots of different options there. Maybe there's a soccer field over there, and maybe you just change the elevation of the wall that currently goes around the soccer field. Maybe you create a berm and you create some elevated seating or some seating in that area but we do see that the most appropriate alignment in there is close to that coastal edge over there. And then of course you see the natural high ground back behind there. Next slide. All right, so in summary, we're looking at long-term risk, and we're looking at tying our long-term projects into those immediate projects that the city, Boston Water Sewer Commission, Massport, MBTA, all of these other stakeholders, and there's lots of private stakeholders out there. That's one thing. If you know of a project happening out there, we may or may not be aware of it. So please, take advantage of this opportunity to share what you know with us. In addition to that, it's a matter of understanding what the current impacts are and understanding what happens if we build something. What are your concerns? What happens if we don't build something? What are your concerns? And then we will utilize all of that in a very holistic way as some of our considerations in order to identify what is the appropriate tool to address the risk and the level of risk that we're trying to in each particular area. And it may be a little bit different, and that's okay. I think the next slide is a couple of QR codes, right, Kate?
It is. So as
Wonderful.
I
I'll
put
turn it
in the
over to
chat,
you.
yeah, I put in the chat the links to these. So if you don't have your phone handy to take a photo, the links to submit comments online is in the chat, as well as the ability to book a virtual appointment with us if you want to get together in small group or do a one-on-one appointment. We also have the opportunity to meet with you in a smaller group setting. Both of these are available on our project website, which is boston.gov/USACE-study. And I'm going to leave these up just so that folks can kind of take a photo or grab their phone if they have it. And we're going to use our remaining time tonight just to walk through additional questions and answers that you may have. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to, you may type your question into the chat and I will read it back for folks to answer. Or you can raise your hand, similar to what we have been doing tonight, and I will call on you so that we can answer your question. I will call on folks in the order that they raise their hand. And I see that there is a question in the chat, so I'm actually going to jump to that first question from Bud. What about the shipyard complex by Jeffrey's Point? Is it already sufficiently elevated? So for that one, Jeff, I think I'm going to turn that over to you to kind of talk a little bit more about the non-structural toolkit when thinking about the Jeffries Point and the shipyard. And if y'all will forgive me, I'm going to step back to that slide just to bring the map up for the visual here. So if you recall, Jeff, this was where we had walked through, and this is very much part of our working waterfront, the shipyard area here. So it's to the east of our Pierce Park intervention up here. But as you can see in the blue, this is currently being shown as an area where it's outside of a physical district, which means a non-structural solution. Do you want to talk more about that, Jeff?
Yeah, so let's understand why we're talking about a non-structural solution first. A, during construction, if we were to come in and try to construct something along the water's edge here, it would have significant impacts on the existing working waterfront, which may or may not be able to temporarily be impacted by construction. B, the other piece is you have lots of different slips and vessels that moor in this area. And so if we have to construct something along the edge there, are they permanently or temporarily impacted? And so those are some areas and some reasons why potentially you wouldn't want to construct something. The other consideration is what elevation, how high do you have to build something? If it's a harbor walk behind it and people are just walking and beautiful, it's great. But if you are somebody who has to operate just-in-time operations or construction or other shipyard operations in that area, it may not be feasible to build a 3, 4, 5, 6-foot wall and block that access off for prolonged periods of time. But in this area, it may make more sense to cut the flood pathways off on both sides and then actually do some building adaptation, non-structural physical changes to the structures, elevating the mechanical, electrical, fire suppression up out of the way, making the first couple feet potentially floodable. And to have evacuation plans and those types of emergency action plans to make this area resilient, as opposed to trying to construct something along it and have more adverse impacts than really is acceptable.
Thank you, Jeff. Bud, did that answer your question?
There is another question that I want to highlight here. Are there red lines on these maps representative of project feasibilities already worked out, or at least initially scoped? The answer is we have identified that the projects in these areas based on the red line are constructible, and they would be engineeringly feasible based off of the subsurface information that we already have and the wave conditions and the water conditions that we know about. So there's still some questions to be had about full environmental impacts. There's still some questions to be had about constructability based off of which type of feature it is. But generally speaking, we've identified that we can construct in those areas. The second part of that question is probably just as important. Is that written up anywhere? The answer, no, not yet. Again, this is the start of the conversation. We will come back out in November, December timeframe for the official kind of NEPA public scoping period, at which time we will be able to provide more information and more data as we continue to refine what our options are for interventions in this area. And then the next step after that, there will be another follow-on engagement around probably right after the new year, January, February 2026 timeframe, in which time we will actually publish a full draft report that has all of our engineering analysis, all of our kind of, we call them formulation strategies, but really it's why are we recommending where we're recommending. And so it will better get at what you're asking for, John. And I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, John, if you want to go off mute.
Sure, thank you. That's helpful. A bunch of questions, but I'll just throw out one from the map you have, the different regions. There was one area highlighted as EBEH, East Boston, Eagle Hill. So basically the Chelsea Creek from the McCardle Bridge going up to the Chelsea Street Bridge, basically. And there's nothing really identified there. I'm just curious as to whether conversations have been had or with some of the property owners. And in particular, I'm thinking of on the basis of some work that Myra and the Resilient Mystic Collaborative did on a sort of tabletop exercise. and looking at the flood maps, the Energy Transfer Partners, the jet fuel facility is really one of the first areas at in that sort of mapping of probability and risk of impact. That's definitely one that has a huge impact, given the fact that it's where all the jet fuel is. Um, and it's also an area that's very much at risk. And so far, the property owners have not really done, aside from replacing a boat cleat, they haven't really done anything on that property for a while. So I'm just curious if there's been conversations with them and or Massport to figure out how they secure that facility.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know that the city, Chris and Kate, have more information than I do about what kind of they've been evaluating in that Eagle Hill area. So I'll ask Kate or Chris to come off mute and talk a little bit about what the city's observing.
Maybe to start with John, just to confirm, you're really looking your point between the Chelsea and McCardle bridges, the EBEH area. And so, Jeff, I think for this stretch, we'd be looking at a set of non-structural interventions, John, to your point, which would mean a set of conversations with the property owners about what might be feasible, not to do a district scale intervention, but to do a more property level intervention. Jeff, Kate, if I'm misstating that, though, please feel free to correct me.
Yep, that's exactly right. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, John, for that question. So kind of to give you the background here and to your earlier question about what you can expect to see for documentation too, these orange segments that are drawn underneath where the yellow circled numbers are is where the Army Corps is working on the next step of this work, which is the first step was to look at what could be constructible or feasible for structures. Where could they build something that would do a district scale protection? For the East Boston Eagle Hill neighborhood, you see that that isn't circled, and we didn't have any locations aligned today because that is an area where, based on the number of properties that are in this darker gray layer, that is the same as that blue layer, it's the flood risk layer, is identifying that there are specific parcels where non-structural solutions or parcel by parcel uh, recommendations might be made by the Corps and included as part of the next step of feasibility study. So at this point in time, because they do have to work through that specific process that I mentioned at the beginning of the night, for areas where we have, and similar to Bud's question, the Jeffreys Point shipyard property in particular, those are two distinct areas where the non-structural or how to look at solutions property by property would be the next step in the process after figuring out where the district scale protections are first. But Jeff, feel free, did I answer that correctly for kind of where that is in the process?
Yeah, and I apologize because I was thinking about a different location. So yes, to that point, those require a much more micro level examination and discussion with individual property owners to find out what their willingness is. Because yes, while it's cost shared, 65-35, it requires an inconvenience on those property owners, and it requires some real estate access to be able to maintain and inspect those particular areas. So until we understand what those full interventions look like, we can't really highlight we're going to just recommend non-structural across the whole area. We have to look at it more individually. Now, specifically looking into jet fuel tanks and those particular areas, we have to work with not only the property owners there, but we have to consider the HTRW and the contaminants in that area. And so in order to construct a wall around that, you're looking at some significant challenges from a constructability standpoint, or could you create resilience within the tanks themselves or in the tank farm itself in order to keep the water out and protect from the pollutants from escaping during a storm.
But thank you for noting that, John. I'm going to take that away as an action item for me and for Jeff as we continue our work to bring up specifically with Massport too. So thank you for highlighting that. And we have another question in the
Oh,
chat that I'm just going to
there's a
jump right
great
to.
question.
Will the city of
Yeah, I like that
Boston
question.
need to work with the city of Chelsea on any of these projects? Thank you, Tracy. Great question.
Yeah,
Jeff,
so
sounds
there
like
is
you
a
want to.
sister study going. Yeah, there's a sister study going on right now. I have a partner, Barbara Boomeris, who's working with state EEA, and we're looking at resilience across 17 different coastal communities within the Boston Harbor, including the city of Boston. And so not only do we have to consider the city of Chelsea, but we also have to consider Revere. We also have to consider Somerville. We also have to consider Saugus up to the north. And so as we are looking at where our floodplain is and what our recommended interventions are to manage the risk, we have to consider, are we transferring any risk? Or is any risk being transferred into this project area that we, in order to make our project successful, have to construct in other communities? So the answer at this point is we have not identified any need to construct in other municipalities. However, we are working closely with that other sister study and the state to make sure that we integrate our solution and our system recommendations into that larger regional 17 community plan.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions that folks have tonight or items that they'd like to share with the group? We did get a score update. Thank you. Thank you, Bud. Red
Thanks,
Sox are
Bud.
down 1-0 in the fifth. John, go for it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything just because as soon as I said it was 0-0 in the bottom of the second, a certain individual who happens to be a Yankees fan let me know that they had just hit a home run. And so I stopped giving score updates because I didn't want to make it insurmountable.
John, go for it.
Don't jinx us. Just in terms of this being looking at the sort of longer term long-term projects to address long-term risk. And obviously it's the Army Corps of Engineers, so it's engineering. But I'm just sort of curious as to when we do look at the long term, 2070 and beyond, there are some areas that are going to be, to your point of the sort of real estate aspect of this. They just might not be viable as real estate. And I'm just wondering where that plays in. Where do we measure, where do you cut bait on a project? There's always an engineering solution with enough money. But when is there a point? I mean, the ocean is infinite, basically. So at what point do you cut bait on a given area and say, listen, we can't develop this, or we can't allow human habitation in this area without the idea that you'll be, in a houseboat. Does that play into this, or is it all just basically hold the line on everything?
So
Great
Chris, I'm going to
question.
start and then I'd like you to chime in. And I'm going to start by saying what you're referring to is what I refer to as managed retreat. A lot of people understand managed retreat of I'm coming in tomorrow and I'm buying your house and you're out of here and we're going to turn this all into a wetland. That is called buyout and acquisition, and it is an option. However, that's not what we're considering here. What we're considering here is potentially managed retreat in the future, and that is it takes time in order to develop infrastructure and the critical infrastructure necessary to support communities. It takes real estate to be able to do that. And so as the community looks forward 50 years to 75 years to 100 years, we need to buy time. And so to your exact point, maybe it makes sense in the near term to defend in place and to construct engineering solutions in order to buy time to make appropriate risk-informed decisions as to saying, okay, water surface elevations are consistently at this level now. So unless this is going to become an island, we can no longer support the infrastructure here. We need to relocate this community over to this location. All of that takes time. So in some locations, are we looking at a managed retreat? Potentially. There are some communities today that recognize that decisions are going to be tough choices are going to have to be made. But that's not a decision for us to make. That's a decision for the city to make in cooperation with those real estate owners. And it's a matter of if this, then what. So what you're referring to is what I like to refer to as managed retreat. A lot of people mistake that for buyout and acquisition. But managed retreat is something that we have to look at. And at what point does engineering solutions become cost prohibitive? So with that being said, I'd like to kind of get the city's perspective on that very kind of conversation.
Sure. I'm happy to maybe just note three quick things. First, that a lot of what you're seeing tonight, John, to your comments earlier in the chat, but yours as well, are places where we're looking at district scale protection to protect sort of large sections of our neighborhoods. There are other areas, John, that you've mentioned where we're actually going to be, and Bud, you've mentioned as well, where we're looking more at supporting individual property owners to address the flood risk that is in front of them. And that is really sort of the focus of this work, whether it is through a district scale intervention or a building level adaptation, how we protect sort of the existing East Boston community and our other neighborhoods. This is also not going to be the last sort of study or effort, but by our work here at a district scale or our work around building adaptation is work which is really focused on a 50-year economic return, a 100-year design life cycle. But there will certainly be sort of other efforts that are going to happen over the course of this century. But this is really the focus of this work, to your point, John, and as Jeff said, is really about to protect our residents in this community in the best way we can right now.
Well, with that, I am leaving up these submit comments online and book appointment with us. I really hope that we can continue this conversation. Thank you again to everyone who joined us tonight. The recording will be posted to the U.S. Army Corps study page of the boston.gov website, as the recording is available sometime tomorrow. But please reach out to us if you'd like to have follow-up conversations. Jeff, would you like to give a little closing to send us home here? And you can't mention the Yankees.
No, I want to thank everybody for taking time out of tonight to come and participate in this conversation, because it's absolutely crucial at this point to kind of paint that picture of what our existing and future without project condition looks like. And it's to understand, hey, this is what where we are seeing potential interventions could be successful. And so remember the two questions I asked you. What if we do nothing? What concerns do you have? And then the other concerns, that what if we do something? How can we integrate this project into the fabric of the community into perpetuity, not just 50 years, not just 100 years, but as we see across the nation, across the world, these flood control projects, navigation projects and such, they've been going on for millennia, and they've been protecting communities for millennia. So how can we now make this system a part of that East Boston community that you can be proud of? And so those are the thoughts and the feedback that we want from you, and we'll be back. We'll be back in December timeframe. And then we'll be back again in the March, April timeframe in order to have more conversations. And that's what's going to be critical to making this project a success, and that is frequent and open communication and dialogue that's honest and transparent. That's what my commitment is to you, and I hope vice versa, that you'll have those, be willing to have those conversations.
So thank you, everybody. Go Sox. Have a good night.